Thank you. So thank you all for coming. And let me just start off for the sake of time. Some believe that distinctions firms face regarding the economic and social outcomes of their operations are all inclusive. And others believe that the expectations are unclear and the world is not as open as we once imagined. Some see the firm as a boundaryless organization and one that operates in a boundaryless market context. Others see others are less keen on an increasingly globalized and open world. So this debate is about how all these contradictions will impact organizational forms. And I see that there are two coexisting and interacting forces. On the one hand, given all this that's happening in these markets, new organizational forms utilize many stakeholders. Firms often flaunt their technologies as new organizational forms. In firms that capitalize open innovation, we see almost non-existing organizational boundaries. On the other hand, national boundaries are more pronounced and strengthened to curb the movement of people, goods, and firms across borders, while there's a widespread notion that people are connected by technologies, ideologies, or preferences that transcend boundaries. So given all this, the question is, how do these two currents, underlying currents, impact our understanding of organizational forms? We're going to use a quite new format for our design. There will be two dimensions, and each debater is going to be a member of the two camps simultaneously. So unlike the other debates that I've done, there's not going to be too much of a struggle between the two camps, but there's going to be more unison. The charge is new organizational forms are needed in an open world. Debaters are Sharon, Aslı, Kalis, and Beth. And that picture almost took me like an hour to do yesterday. I used my lucky coin to determine the orders. First, we'll start with Kalis. And her position is going to be new organizational forms are needed in a not so open world. Sharon, be the second debater. New organizational forms are needed in an open world. Then Beth will talk about existing organizational forms are adequate in an open world. Aslı will be the fourth debater to argue existing organizational forms are adequate in a not so open world. There will be 4 rounds, 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes each in each round. There will be borrowing between periods. So I'm not going to be too harsh on the timing, but I do want them to get their point across in a smooth manner as much as possible. So that's it. Let's start with Kalis.
Okay. Can I share my screen?
Go to share screen at the bottom, the green button with an arrow.
There. Okay, yeah, okay.
Then select your PowerPoint. Yes.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Excellent. It's always amazing when it works. Okay, this is the positioning round, and I thought I'm using slides here because it's quicker, I think. So I use as a definition of an organization a system which has multiple human agents within identifiable boundaries and system level goals towards which the agent's efforts make a contribution. This is a definition due to Purnam Alexei Reitzig that is also Vanish's definition in his book. So I'm adopting it, not being an organization scholar myself, looking for help on that. So when do new organizations arise? Well, the process is evolutionary. There is a line of descent that extends from older forms of organization to newer ones, and timescales matter. So whether you see new kind of depends on what timescale you're worried about. So for example, modern corporations, according to Alfred Chandler, emerged, it really took them about 20 years. And there was another 20 years before where there were nascent forms. But so corporate R&D units emerged. This is Maori, between 1920 and 1940. Digital platforms and ecosystems emerged. Well, 1980 to 2005, some would argue that the emergence is ongoing. I actually think that social media was the last really different kind of platform and ecosystem. So all of these were new forms of organization, and they all descended from older forms. So why did new organizations arise? I believe the main reason is new technology. Technical recipes set new requirements and rewards, which organizations must address. And if they have to change their form to address those needs, they will. The other big one is geopolitical events, and this gets to my not so open position. So low tariffs, the World Trade Organization, all contribute to open global value chains, which are a relatively new phenomenon. COVID, not so open. We have remote work and Zoom. And national rivalries and wars, not so open. I'm old enough to remember the Cold War, and we seem maybe to be starting a new Cold War, Cold War II. More reasons for new organizations: social movements. The labor movements gave rise to unions. Free software gave rise to open source communities. Civil rights, churches and marches, not really so very new. But climate change gave rise to carbon markets, a new form of organization. So I think social movements matter. Cultural differences. Toyota is a different form of organization than GM, an innovation within a modern corporation. So I'm going to end with the idea, putting out the idea of centripetal and centrifugal forces. Centripetal forces, by analogy with physics, favor the integration of technology and the merging of organization. Centrifugal forces favor modularization of technology and the splitting of organizations. And I don't have time to go in depth into what factors give rise to which forces, but I did want to end with a historical look at the changing economic system. In my view, centripetal forces were dominant from 1900 to 1980. And so we saw single firm control and big corporations, vertically integrated corporations by and large. There was a transition period starting with the IBM PC in 1980, continuing through the arrival of the internet and the post-commercial internet period to 1995 to 2000. And then the digital economy came into its own and continues to grow today. So this set of forces, or this transition to a more open, and more centrifugal world, gave rise to digital platforms and ecosystems. So the arrow is moving in the direction of more centrifugal forces, or stronger centrifugal forces. And as of day before yesterday, I said, yeah, but maybe that trend is ending, stopping, maybe even reversing a little bit. And yesterday I attended a seminar in which, and I verified this, the best estimate of remote online workers worldwide is 160 million people. And that seems like pretty centrifugal to me. So I just would put up the question mark of, has this trend towards more dispersed work, more centrifugal organizations, has it really stopped, or is it continuing? And that is my position.
Beautiful, thank you. Sharon? Carlos, may I ask you to not share your screen?
No, I will unshare if I can figure it out. Sorry. Nope. Sorry.
Sharon, let's go ahead and start with you for the sake of time.
Okay.
My apologies. I stopped to share.
No, you're good. You're good. So I too have slides, but I think I'm going to just use them as talking points. Again, I want to thank Ilgaz for organizing this today. It takes an enormous amount of work and time and energy to organize these events. So thank you very much. We're all the beneficiaries of your hard work. You know, as I was looking at our different talking points and the debate and the setup, I thought in many ways this feels artificial. All the questions that we're being asked are right under certain conditions, and context does matter. Some theories work under certain contexts where stability and the rule of law matter, you know, more established paradigms. But some contexts and markets are rapidly being created and shaped, and there may not be a rule of law, or the rule of law can't keep up, such as, you know, many things that are going on the internet, cryptocurrencies, that type of thing. So maybe we do need new explanations, new theory, but certainly not all the time. I'm going to talk a little bit about economic organizational structure in the form of the firm, because that's where I've done some work. And I also want to note that the ideas I'm discussing today build on work that I've done over years with several co-authors, Barney, Porak, Sachs, and Sanders. And so this talk wouldn't be possible if I hadn't worked with them. You know, questions of economic organization have mostly been in the domain of economists, and we know the names, you know, Coase, Williamson, Jensen, McLean, Hart, Holmstrom, Triol, Milgram, Roberts, Grossman, Warrens, and Gullis, and I'm sure I've missed some, but I wanted to cover that. But they kind of fell into three buckets, which were transaction cost economics, agency, you know, where you align employee actions with firm owners, and complete contracting. And some of these economic theories have been important. They've been influential. They've had much to say about firms and why they exist. The theories still matter. And I don't want anyone to say, oh my God, Sharon's ready to throw things out, because I'm not by any means saying that. But there is a growing sense that there may be some important limitations as we move into the future. And I loved the way Carla set things up, because I think she's right. You know, these are important ways of looking at the world a little bit differently. And maybe we need to revise theory to describe economic activity. And again, really kind of building on what Carla said earlier, you know, some of the limitations that we've seen to what we've got in terms of theory of organizing economic activity, you know, our theories tend to focus on firm boundaries as opposed to how bundles of exchanges can help generate social and economic value ecosystem settings. And there's some debate whether the theories fit or don't fit these. Residual claimants, you know, shareholders versus stakeholders, and even the very firm objectives may vary across different countries and contexts, if you will. And really, shareholder supremacy is even seen as immoral in some contexts. What's the meaning of ownership? You know, private property rights as opposed to a common collective of property rights. You know, versus maybe the creation of the firm as a creation of a social environment in which people can prosper. The question that most drives me, and I'm the most interested in, has always been that these theories take the economic value that can be created through cooperation as given, and then they examine the most efficient way to organize that effort, how to efficiently organize value. Well, you know, the reason that bothers me so much as an entrepreneurship scholar is because that tends to assume away the problems associated with NIDE and uncertainty in entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship is the central driver in today's world, and the creation of new to the world products and services. So I'm not talking innovation, because I know there'll be somebody in the back in the chat who will say, you know, Sharon, there is room for innovation, but when we talk about innovation in the old theories, we assume R&D oftentimes. And I will talk about technological developments and the importance of that. But I'm currently working on a paper with a student, and we just pulled up a little statistic that I think is worth considering. There are 380,000 patents in the US alone approved by the Patent Office. Out of that, 30,000 of those make it into the market as a market product. So we're not talking R&D and patents, we're talking markets, new markets. And out of those 30,000 that make it into the market or create a new market, 95% of those fail. So there's something else that we need to really kind of think about besides just the technology, which I agree, things like AI, blockchain, and so forth. But then the question that arises with all these things is what's left of labor? And the argument tends to be that educated labor may remain. I don't know. I'm not sure how I've fallen on that list more and more, but so now we're going to ask people to give their creativity, their ingenuity, their time, their knowledge, right, all of this. And we want to try and think about organizations as hierarchy or flat and regular incentives, you know, fiat, so forth. So how do we think about all of this? And there's, again, and I'm going to hurry because I'm going to run out of time and Ilgaz is going to ding me, but there's less distinction between markets and hierarchies today. The distinctions were always kind of blurred, and you can probably remember the old example that was way back when I was starting out, which was of the Xerox guy that went to the firm every day. Was he in or out? Well, today I have Monica with AI who, you know, on Chat GPT, who chats with me at midnight or 1 in the morning, whenever it is I want to do work. So where are those boundaries these days? So the entrepreneurship perspective is that when a firm has yet to exist and the outcomes and products and services are unknown, why do individuals come to self-identify with a firm, a product, or a service? Why do they make investments in activities with unknown outcomes? You know, why would individuals organize in these conditions of night and uncertainty? And I don't think we have the answers to that yet. Now, some of the work I've been doing, and Ilgaz, I know you're going to ding me. Give me a minute from one of my other responses. But, you know, I've been working on some stuff on common ground, which is a plausible view of human nature. And I loved what Carla said at the very beginning when she was talking about multiple human agents. We are human beings. And I think we need to consider that as we begin to think of, you know, how firms, and you're absolutely right, how do they emerge? How do they evolve? What's the evolutionary? It isn't so much looking at things in a static world as I think we've been looking. So I'm going to leave this conversation now with, you know, a theory that explains everything explains nothing. Theories have boundaries. And I think we're bumping up against the reality of new ways of organizing economic wealth, such as anti-globalization or globalization, technological changes that were unforeseeable, and entrepreneurship. These things are really challenging our organizational forms and how we theorize about these forms. Okay, Ilgaz, I'm done.
Thank you. So we're doing consumption smoothing, and you owe me 2 minutes. Thank you. It is now Beth's time.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Ilgaz, and my fellow panelists. Ilgaz asked me to sort of take the position that existing organizational forms are adequate in an open world. And that kind of, this is going to be a bit different to what Carlos and Sharon have done. It kind of made me take a deep dive into sort of an historical perspective. I'm a frustrated historian. Mm-hmm. And it struck me that in terms of openness, the recent protectionism that we're seeing, and I'm in the throes of writing papers on firms affected by sanctions, but it's not a new thing. You know, we all know about mercantilism, which was pretty protectionist. U.S. trade policies until World War II, especially from the mid-1860s, 1800s, were until the world wars, they were very, very protectionist. So this is, you know, what we're seeing is not as bad as it's been before. And there's actually an awful lot of regional trade agreement activity that's pretty exciting. In the Asia Pacific, we see the newer version of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And one thing that I'm very, very excited about is in Africa, the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I think this has huge potential for that particular context. In terms of other aspects of openness, communication is easier than ever. Money transfer is often a lot less complicated than it used to be if we leave out the US and its stubborn insistence on clinging to physical checks. Much of the world is finally actually catching up with world-leading Kenya and M-Pesa with respect to mobile money, and that's pretty cool. In terms of organizational forms, as you've already heard, organizations have adapted to new environments throughout history. A lot of the current research is suggesting that emerging market multinationals are new, but realistically, most of the early multinationals were really from what we would now consider emerging or developing markets. And you can go back to the East India companies in the Netherlands and the UK. Those are the 1600s. Toyota's first foreign direct investment was in the US in 1958. And I am old enough to remember that well, maybe not back then, but made in Japan at that point did not signify high quality. Japan was very much an emerging market at the time. International new ventures, they're not new. They're really much more widespread now, and which makes them much more fun to study. But I have data that shows that there was a Finnish international new venture in 1700, and Mira Wilkins has discussed freestanding companies which flourished from the mid-19th century until World War I, mainly in British colonies. They were international new ventures. Service sector internationalization is a big thing in the IB literature. But again, the Sogo Shosho, the general trading companies, have been operating out of Japan from the mid-1800s, and they are nothing but service sector internationalization. Networks and ecosystems, they're really long-standing in a lot of sectors, such as traditional crafts and weaving here in India. And we've done some work with Kyuhiko Ito on extremely long-lived firms, as we're talking like, over 500 years of continuous operations under the same family ownership in Japan. And those are strictly about ecosystems centered around Buddhist temples. So you have firms that do the construction and the temple fixtures and food for the priests. And it's very much an ecosystem. Open innovation. Toyota has been really happy to teach firms, including competitors, about the Toyota production system for ages. They know nobody can do it quite as well as they can. We can talk about non-market strategy and corporate social responsibility. Again, there are long-standing examples of this. So what we're seeing all these things are becoming bigger and more prominent and more important. But I think we need to remember that they're not new. And so I worry a little bit about, whether we're looking at really new organizational forms, or have we as researchers just been kind of slow to recognize what firms have been doing all along. And I do think that we've been a bit guilty of studying what's easier to study rather than what's really important to study. For example, in international business, we spend a lot of time looking at the initial market entry. It's easier to get data. It's more feasible, but it's not necessarily the question we should be looking at. Damn, 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. And first round, Aslı. Please unmute yourself.
Okay.
Thanks.
I just did. Thank you. So I'll start with my punchline, and you'll see that it's going to resonate with the previous speakers on some dimensions, and it's going to, in my explanation, I'm going to deviate a little bit in why I think that in essence, we have not so new organizational forms, and I'm going to focus specifically on platforms for that. And I'm not going to go into too much detail in terms of why it's not so open world, because of the previous speakers' comments about protectionism, which has always been around. And also we're seeing even for TikTok in the US, Pew Center researched it and figured out that 64% wants it to be banned. So they're kind of this trend of protectionism existing already, and we see examples of it in the case of the firms. So I'll start with my fundamental argument about why we don't have new organizations, but they might have transformed into something that we already know and we haven't realized it. And I'll start like sharing with COS 37. So the idea of the firm is that it directs resources to their uses. And the firm then was discussed as being the central planning mechanism, as opposed to the market competition via price mechanisms. And the central planner is and this is direct quote from COS, is the entrepreneur coordinator who directs production. In fact, the predecessors of COS also use these terms coordination and planning interchangeably. I think along the way, we interpret coordination more of an arm's length type hybrid interaction than what they were using it for planning purposes. But when I combine the concepts of central planning and resource allocation in the same sentence, we're not thinking about the firm, we're thinking about socialism with the government as a central planner. So then my first insight out of this is firm organizes limited economic activity directed by its production function, and the firm itself is a private central planning mechanism. And not surprisingly, and this was one of the reasons why Hayek shared his Nobel Prize with a Swedish economist, sociologist who was a socialist at the time, and Hayek identified himself as a liberal scholar. In the 40s and onward, he, in his writings, Hayek contrasted market economy with the command economy, with the central planner. And in doing so, he articulated the main argument against command economy, why this doesn't work. And it's articulated as a well-known knowledge problem for the central planner. So categorically, it's not possible to access dispersed knowledge. And I love the fact that Carlos also used the idea of dispersed people, which is consistent with the idea of dispersed people and their dispersed knowledge, which is private, held by all market participants by central planning. So there's no way to access it. Therefore, we cannot optimally allocate resources. But in contrast, markets with its price mechanism and the process of market interaction circumvents this problem. Now, Kerzner takes this up and in the early 80s explains that the issue that the knowledge problem presents is a problem of needing to access simultaneously, instantaneously, information on the preferences, which is the demand side, and the production, which is the supply side, of many entities on both ends that the planning process would need. So the second insight that I have is central planning and therefore command economy is suboptimal because of the need to simultaneously and instantaneously access information on preferences and production. Now, I kind of try to stress that because what if this dispersed knowledge problem is solved? That solution would be that the organizing principle would obtain this dispersed information on preferences of people on the demand side and production of the suppliers simultaneously and instantaneously. I mean, that should sound a little familiar because that's the definition of a platform business. Then the central planner and command economy with some scope would work. So then what are platform businesses? If we follow this kind of line of logic, they are private central planners that command economic activity with increasing scope. So I'll give time. I'm going to steal 1 minute. So my example is, and I maybe based on the questions, comments from my fellow debaters or panelists, is Amazon, for instance. Look at the scope, 1.2 million people. A federal government has 1.8 million people as employees, 50% are market share of online retail. And if you look at the scope of it, it's huge. And if you look at some of the things that it does, it provides housing, it has regulatory agencies, it has exclusive supplier, it's the exclusive supplier to businesses, local and federal procurement. As I said, it has rating agencies that are exclusive. It collects in the form of tax any sales that is done through them, $1. It provides education, creates new degrees, has 250 higher education institutions that work in coordination with Amazon. It has a counterfeit crimes unit. It develops law and regulation in the space. It has a Project Culper. It's a satellite broadband communication network. So, I mean, if you look at all this, it sounds very much like a private government, which is a central planner of a command economy, which is 50% of e-commerce.
Now, we're going to be doing the crossfire, which is going to be 4 minutes each. You can ask questions to each other and make comments on what was being said. And again, things that you have not had a chance to speak about in the first round, you can obviously do. I'm still going to do consumption so smoothing. We're again starting with Carlis.
Okay, and I probably won't take all 4 minutes, but maybe come in again later. So I love, so many different perspectives here. It's hard to get my mind around them, even though I'm taking notes. So Azli, with Amazon, it's the rise of, or it's the development of the big tech platforms, the way they are evolving, that caused me to believe until yesterday that the arrow was switching back and that we are seeing more centripetal forces leading to the formation of large enterprises that do, in a lot of ways, resemble Chandlerian firms in their use of unified governance, one single place of decision making, as opposed to an ecosystem of autonomous firms, and direct authority within the corporate boundary, and hierarchy, because they got to manage this stuff, and there's a ton that goes on, and hierarchy is a tool for managing complexity. Yes. Let me just say why I think this is happening in the platform ecosystems. You're right, Azli's right. The platform is a governing mechanism. It provides a higher level of coordination than Hayek was envisioning with prices. So it has to get some things done. Even a market, even the back office of a market, even before the digital age, had to get some things done, had to record exchanges and make sure the properties were transferred. So the big tech, the big platforms, and there is a lot of economies of scale and scope in these platforms. They have a core of activity that needs to be tightly coordinated, not loosely coordinated the way their users and customers are. So they continue to be platforms with ecosystems, but their cores are getting larger and larger. And I don't, because of basically economies of scale and scope, I think like Chandler's firms, but even more so, they are not going to be displaceable anytime soon. The time of entrepreneurship for the big tech platforms is, I think, over. There's still entrepreneurship in the edges, but not in the middle. So yes, we do keep, his history doesn't repeat itself, but the themes are the same, a lot of them. Whether you consider what they do novel, I mean, my question is always, could the people running the East India Company have with their skills and knowledge of the time, run a digital platform. And I just don't think so. So to me, that says digital technology required lots and lots of innovation. And you know, at what point does a difference in quantity become a difference in category? At what point do you say, well, yes, there's a phylum, you know, everybody descends from everybody else, but there are new species that arise in response and because of new environments. So that's why, what are we calling it? Crossfire?
Yes, beautiful. Thank you. You gave actually a lot of things to talk about. Sharon, please.
So I just have like thoughts going through my mind. But one of the thoughts I have most going through my mind is we need to write a paper, right? So I'm the ultimate academic. We need to write a paper. That's how I keep thinking. You know, there's been a lot of agreement. We mostly seem to agree that there's, you know, environmental change, and a lot of things are changing out there. And one of the things that I guess as I think about it, and I just sort of think about some of the change that's being driven, we are now trading, and this kind of goes back to, I think, Asla's point, we may be in a position to have trading partners that we're at war with. And I think that might actually be a first. I don't know. So you guys, I'm looking to the three of you because you've kind of looked at the history of this. But I do think that's an interesting development, is sort of we may be trading with partners that we're at war with. And I don't know, you know, maybe the early mercantilism, you know, there's an example from there. But I think what technology does, and the Amazon and the Alibaba and TikTok, and, you know, again, even the nature of protectionism has changed, right? Because what are we protecting about now? You know, what's our infant industries that we're protecting? We're protecting intellectual knowledge. We're protecting our, you know, this kind of ability to reach into markets in a different way. And so I think that's really interesting, and I kind of wonder how that has changed. You know, as I think about Kirzner and Hayek, and I frankly like Hayek's work better than Kirzner's work, but that's just me. You know, again, as they thought about all these things, and as they talk about knowledge, even though they treat knowledge somewhat differently, here's what they all have the same. They assume knowledge somehow exists. And there's an existence of knowledge, and we just have to all go about kind of discovering it. We may not all have the same knowledge, and we may not know where all this knowledge is, but, you know, they really didn't address, which is, I forget if it was Carlos or Elizabeth now who made the point, you know, would some of the early, you know, people understand the digital platforms of today? And the answer was no. And that is probably because knowledge doesn't like all exist and is waiting to be found. We create knowledge, we as human beings. And that's why I think it's so important to kind of go back to people as human, you know, people as humans, but go back to note that we have a human condition, and that human condition, you know, we do good and we do bad, but we're moving, we're creating new knowledge, and knowledge is not all out there in the world. Now, in case you haven't figured it out, I'm a social constructionist, right? So I do believe knowledge is always created, and it's people who construct their worlds. But I do think it's important as we start to think about this and move forward, to think about the role of knowledge and the role of people creating new knowledge. And then I guess the last thing I want to leave, and you know, it's kind of this notion of planning versus price. But I wonder if now, as we begin to think about, you know, there's planning, there's price, and maybe again with the firm or these organizational forms, again, I want to go back. You know, when the activities of humans reach a point where they can't really evolve without coordinated action through cooperation, further relationship building, and the market doesn't exist or can't control the entrepreneurial activity, a firm may actually be this alternative, not because of planning or price, but because it's a safe place where you can innovate and be creative and create new knowledge and have conversations and do what people do. And so I think with that, I'm going to leave it. So, I guess I'm looking at, does the firm exist to provide a context for entrepreneurial value, for value as opposed to some of the things that we've traditionally been thinking about? All right, hopefully I cut it a little bit shorter than my last time.
Yes, you still owe me a minute. Thank you. But I was surprised that you didn't follow up on Carlos's comment about the end of entrepreneurship in certain firms, but except for the peripheries.
Actually, I don't disagree with that. I don't think entrepreneurship in some of these firms is going to be disruptive. I think where entrepreneurship is going to disrupt is in what we're not envisioning yet, right? So I think it's the unforeseen future, right? So I never foresaw cryptocurrency. In fact, I remember when Bitcoin first came out and this crypto came out, I thought that was like the most stupid, ridiculous thing. I'm like, who are these people that are willing to trade money, like real fiat, who are willing to trade money for some kind of weird computer algorithm? And now I'm the proud owner of Bitcoin, right? And so I think it's what we don't see. So I have no quibble with Carlos.
That's another debate, Sharon, but we'll definitely get back to that one. It's now Beth's turn. Yes, 4 minutes. Thank you.
Oh, goodness, I enjoy listening to you guys. I also was surprised at and interested in hearing what Sharon's perspective was on this, entrepreneurship over in the context of large platforms. That surprised me a lot when you said that, Carlos. And also I thought what you were talking about was what struck me. Okay, I'm in India, but I live in New Zealand. So yeah, I see borders differently to most people, national borders differently to most people. When you're talking, it struck me, Asli, that Amazon is more of a nation state than many countries, including New Zealand. It's bigger than New Zealand, certainly in terms of economic value. And I think one of the things that I like this notion that, with the boundaries of firms are really blurring quite a lot. And I think that this has big implications for our theorizing. And I don't know how to address that. But I think that's a real challenge because I'm primarily a quantitative researcher, and frankly, if nation states go away, that stuffs up my analysis. But I think it's going to create more and more challenges in terms of studying what it is that we want to be studying, because we make these assumptions about nation states, about the boundaries of firms, and I think that they're less and less convincing. I think we also need to be thinking a lot about, as I think Sharon mentioned, context really matters. I think a lot of these issues look very different from large or small countries because there's a hugely different nature of trade and what's being protected. And I think that's something that we haven't considered so much. And again, it's got to do with, there's so much stuff to study that we tend to study stuff that's studyable. Wow, that was circular. But I think these are things that have come up as I've been listening to the three of you, and I'd be fascinated to know what you guys think about what do you expect to see in 20 years? 20 years ago, things were, as Carlos said, I think there's a strong line of history, but that could be quite fascinating. And I think the other thing is that we're studying everything from the perspective of the organization, which is what we're supposed to be doing in this session. But I think we also need to think about the perspective of individuals. We know that these new, economic openness creates winners and losers, And I think that we don't put enough thought into the people whose lives are upended and who are left behind. And I think we're seeing a lot more, well, a tremendous amount of income inequality, and as firms benefit from an open economy. And I think we need to think about who benefits and who loses. That's me.
Thank you. Aslı, please.
Okay, very, very, very interesting comments and insights. I'm digesting all of them, trying to. So one of the things that I want to highlight is that if we look at the platforms and compare them to traditional hierarchy, we will see very different. They'd be, to Carlos's point, very different species. But if we look at platforms and compare it to Beth's point, to nation states, or much more of a where public administration studies, much more of that type of organizing, then they don't look so different. Now, one of the things that I'm interested in understanding how is that transition happened with the platforms. For instance, what compelled Amazon to have a $2 billion housing funding for affordable housing project alongside public transportation lines? And they're already constructing it. They have a bill in Seattle, state bill, I think 5426. I can't find it in my notes now. Anyway, it's about this housing preferences and opening up zones. But I looked at the bill, and Amazon is nowhere there as a sponsor, or it doesn't have any kind of say in any of the public meetings on that. But if you look at Amazon's website, it cites the bill and says we're sponsoring it, we're encouraging it. So we do need to kind of look at these types of very large organizations, not just of their size, but because of their preferences and how they allocate the resources and the value that they create. To Carlos's point, if Amazon, and I'm not sure if Alibaba is exactly like this, I haven't studied it, I would love to, is that Amazon also has a track that has Amazon vendor program. And how you become a vendor is there's no application. Amazon sends you an email and says, do you want to be our vendor? And if you agree to it, and it's a yes, no, it's not even a negotiation, you are taken to the application kind of site sign up page, so to speak, where Amazon buys your product, sets the price. So you see, price setter, and that is a command economy. Sets the price and then kind of takes care of everything. But when you have Amazon vendor, you also have individual sellers competing on its in its marketplace. But because Amazon has the vendor programming, setting the price with the full information from the other set of independent suppliers is not a free market kind of system that this platform is organizing. I'm not saying that it should, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't, but I'm just trying to understand as a form. I can't compare to my traditional hierarchies, to Carlos's point, but now I feel like I should be comparing them to central planner that used to be public and in the realm of nation states and governments, a private version of it.
Thank you. Now we're going to do rebuttals, 3 minutes each. We're going to respond and get things off our chest. Thank you.
Okay, we're not in rebuttal mode, this group. No, we're in, common ground. So I want to pick on what each person said, and if I run out of time, so be it. So Sharon, firm is a safe place. I have a paper on where the transactions come from, and there's a concept in it, transaction-free zone. Not free as in transactions are free, but free of transactions. No, transactions are too expensive. Basically, it comes out of our human nature. We create transaction-free zones. This forum is a transaction-free zone. We are not pricing every word or every sentence or every concept. We are sharing. And the world, basically, the economy took social transaction-free zones, which are social groups, going back to families and villages, and sort of created these safe places where transactions could bring stuff in and out. As to where this all started, I want to highly recommend a guy named Michael Tomasello, who is German, studies, he studies the origins of communication and the origins of cooperation by comparing the highest level of apes, chimpanzees, basically, to human babies, and tracking where they differ. I found a marvelous series of very accessible books on what makes us human. And it is not barter and haggling. That came later. So anyway, I love the unforeseen future. So Beth, boundaries are blurring, and things look more. So I'm going to switch sides and say we have seen that movie before. It's called An Empire. So the Spanish had one, the British had one. There have been many Indian empires. They're a funny thing where the lines between nation states and the empire get kind of blurry, but the centers there remained. So, and what do you expect in 20 years? I am so fearful these days. Asli, I love your examples, and again, there seems to be the thing that's emerging in the platform universe is, they still have shareholders, and they make a ton of money, still, and they control a ton of. They are super oligopolists. Chandler said 10 years of oligopoly, 10 years of competition, 100 years of oligopoly. And these guys are not oligopolists, they're super oligopolists. So, unfettered, they will go stronger. I think they understand that they need to exhibit social responsibility, or they're going to get majorly regulated. I just want to share one story about, this is sort of to the next 20 years, but I listened, this was maybe 10 years ago, to one of David Autor's co-authors talk about what they were finding about the impact of China's competition, China's imports on labor forces in cities. So that they were looking at the level of the SMSA, I guess, and doing very careful comparisons so that they really had it on import substitution by industry. And they were showing that the jobs were being lost, and the other contra classic microeconomics, the other industries in the SMSAs were not picking up those workers. They were not hiring the people whose jobs were gone. And I went home to my husband and I said, we need to rethink trade. We cannot sustain trade theory with this kind of impact on inequality and on people's life, because jobs are part of what make humans human. The feeling of, I do something, I matter. I'm not living off. So I don't see a lot of progress in solving the problem of inequality. And so I see increased polarization in our country and increased polarization in the world. And that makes me very fearful.
Thank you. Actually, this is the rebuttal section. You just gave a lot of things again. Sharon, gloves off now.
So, you know, I agree. I think this is common ground. I disagree with the debate thing. I think we have more common ground than we know. And, you know, I want to take this winners, people are winners and losers. You know, there really has been a lot of displacement. And the thinking used to be, and we saw it in the United States, right? So we saw in the US when certain industries went someplace else, you know, the notion was it's okay because something else will take its place and as a country we'll be better. And, you know, that kind of thinking got us into trouble in many ways, right? Because the people that were displaced, they are displaced. So we've seen whole communities of people. I'm very unsurprised that the opioid crisis in the US started in Southern Ohio, right? Because Ohio was into manufacturing and we saw tons of displaced communities. When I was on the faculty at Ohio State, we had a community, and I forgot its name. It was right by us, though, right by the campus. And it had an 81% unemployment rate. 81% unemployment rate. Butting up next to a campus, one of the world's, you know, most influential campuses. So I do think that's a problem. And entrepreneurship by its very nature, I think, pushes the boundaries of that problem even more. Right? By its very nature, entrepreneurship causes winners and losers. But I will argue on the other side that the profit motivation may not be all bad. And I'm going to go back to Henry Ford, right? So Henry Ford, who's somebody who I actually think a lot of, and I know there's been a lot of debate about, you know, this, that, and the other thing about Henry. But he did more for the workers in the United States in many ways than all the regulation that we were doing. And he did it not because I think he was necessarily a kind man, but because I think he understood that if you don't have consumers, right, at some point in time, somebody's got to make money to buy all those goods and services that you're producing, right? At some point in time, somebody has to buy those, you know, those cars that are being mass produced. And that's, I think, the problem that maybe we're not understanding in some ways because we've had such consumption, but we may be butting up against some of that at this point, right? And so I don't think the profit thing is bad for firms because I actually think it pushes them to think about how we can keep profits going. And in order to do that, I believe they're going to have to become more socially responsible, just like Henry Ford had to be in his time. Not because they want to, or because they're nice, or because they're regulated, but because they have to keep their profit motivation going. Thank you very much about the firm as a safe place. I will take a look at that. You know, I think that's exactly where we're going. And I use the notion of clans. So I'm not so far from this notion of you know, where's the origins of these firms? We talk about clans. Now, Ochi had talked about clans in his early days, but he talked about them as being a type of solution for an organizational problem that already existed. And what I really think is the clans pre-exist the firm. And so we start off with the clans and the clans, not clams, maybe I'm hungry. We start off with the clans and they pre-exist the actual firm. And maybe they continue to exist in the firm after it's formed. But I think clan organization is something we should probably look at more, but not as part of the firm, but as pre-existing the firm. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you.
I just wanted to show you.
Beth, please.
Okay. Gosh, this is an interesting evening for me. Carlos, I love the idea of rethinking trade. I think that's a wonderful reaction. Sharon, I think I'd be interested in knowing. See, I've been my context is driving things here. We've been looking at micro entrepreneurs in several industries here in India, and so sort of this. I think entrepreneurship, it creates opportunity to potentially solve some of these issues. And I'm well aware of the displacement thing. I was working for Ford Motor Company in the late 1970s, and you just had huge numbers of people shifting from Michigan down to Texas because suddenly there were oil jobs there and there was nothing in Michigan. And I've had people since ask, well, why didn't everybody just shift? It's like, well, but people are actually embedded. Home is home for many people. It's a concept I struggle to understand, but I think we are forgetting about that. And I think, we've sort of brought corporate social responsibility into our thinking. I think I'd really like to see us do more about thinking about the actual people who are affected by all of this. I'm not sure I'm making any sense. Yeah, I think that's kind of what I had. Sharon gets one of my minutes back.
Sharon owes me so many minutes now. I stopped counting now. Aslı, please.
I'm in agreement with most of the things that's been said, but I'm also in a little bit of a disagreement in terms of, I don't know if it's disagreement, but different highlight is that I don't think we are currently equipped to understand really looking at the tools that we have, understand really these mega firms and platforms and ecosystems with platforms. The reason is what we see, for instance, in numbers. I'm a empirical researcher as well. What we see in, let's say, income statements, balance sheets, and all the accounting measures and financial measures that we know are not really reflecting a traditional firm that those measures were created for. So in some sense, maybe it's worthwhile to look at government style accounting applied in the context of these firms. For instance, to Carlos's point, I can see maybe that's the reason as they get super big that they were afraid of kind of sort of intervention because of antitrust. And if you look at Amazon social responsibility page, they have legal legal themes and documents that says antitrust is really bad, is as they're one of their bullet points next to human trafficking. So so it's this weird contrast that we're seeing that these firms are really engaged very powerfully in. And if we use our regular tools, we only see the front, which is what looks like a firm, what we think is a firm. But when, as shareholders, for instance, we can look at their net income and we see that it's growing, yes. But in the meantime, their effective tax rate is 5% and they get $5 billion in tax cuts. So it's this mega transfer of where taxes are used to be allocated and governed by, basically with our votes and our selection in this particular political system. Now it's being transferred to firms and through the loop of, let's say, tax cuts, which is allocated by the firm as it sees fit, which is I'm not going to pass a judgment on good thing or a bad thing, but how do we understand it as an organizational form? For instance, how does Amazon compete with Alibaba or the other platforms globally? And what's happening to international expansion? So how do we, for instance, advise such a firm or consult such a firm? Or if you're a manager in that firm, what do you do when you have certification of all the sellers exclusively of DEI dimensions, for instance, or other minority classifications, and then the procurement agencies of all types of firms, local and federal government, exclusively procuring through Amazon system, can kind of click on their choices of their suppliers. So it makes this certification really valuable. So Amazon gets a sort of a tax from everybody who wants to sell, a certification fee. But then the procurement agent can select, I'm willing to pay 10%, 20% higher for the price of procuring if it fits some of the categories I want. So we don't see that for the firms. We don't see that for the federal or local government. So there's so much we end up not seeing that's happening that resonates with me with the comments against command economy. So it's almost like this, big brother effect, not to be too dramatic, but I feel like I'm not equipped to understand or study or teach it really well with the tools that I have. So that's where I was coming from with that. And just a quick question. I don't think we've touched upon it. Is there a way to conceptualize, for instance, the car industry at the beginning when it was emerging with the kind of the visual aid of an ecosystem? So is the ecosystem of, for instance, video streaming exists the way that it does because we're seeing the transition and kind of mixing and matching of industries, emergence of new ones, kind of like a disequilibrium state, but it's so fast that we can see it in our lifetimes because of technology, that it will at some point look like a straightforward vertical chain down the line. So I'm curious about that also, how sustainable these mega structures are over time. And I think several of you brought up that time dimension too. I think that was your interest slide as well. So the time scale of change. And I think I covered my notes. So much to think about.
Thank you. A couple of months ago, we had a debate with Aslı, Tim Divini, Alvaro Cuervo, and Luigi Zingales. And Zingales is a great paper with Oliver Hart, a very recent paper on private sanctions. Private sanctions. So there is something to really think about, and some of you are dancing around it, but not really answering it. If McDonald's can sanction Russia, that is, according to Zingales, it is a declaration of war. And you're saying, some of you are saying companies can do it. Some of you are saying companies should be doing it. I'm really curious. I'm classically trained. I don't think companies are supposed to be doing things like that, but that's just my training. Okay, last 2 minutes. We'll start with Carlos. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be real quick and just echo some things. Despite corporate social responsibility, the law of this land with respect to corporations is shareholder governance. And in pursuit of shareholder value, as set by the financial markets, it is in the interests, and this in part explains platforms, it is in the interests of firms to offload as many externalities as they can, while keeping the central core of the flow of revenue. And when the externalities you're offloading are the high wages your employees are used to receiving, and you're going to southern states and then to Mexico and South America and now to China, and now who knows what's going to happen in that respect. And the lead firm, the systems integrator, is taking all the money and arbitraging differences in wages and other prices. We have a big political problem, our nation. And I think Europe is quite a bit further down the path of both not admiring shareholder governance and doing more intervening on the human side. But they're not in very good shape either in many ways. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to end on such a pessimistic note. I'm a very hopeful person, and you know, if we become not so open, we'll have more. We'll fall back on our own resources, and we can rethink what we owe the places and the people that surround us.
Beautiful, thank you, Sharon.
So I'm going to be even more pessimistic, I'm afraid. This falls on our shoulders and our politicians in many ways, right? So it falls on our shoulders, and I think it was Elizabeth who said this. You know, we haven't caught up to what's going on out there as academics. And the reason we're not catching up as academics, I truly believe, is because we study what's easy. We're into, you know, analyzing data, and everything's so data. We've stopped asking interesting questions and publishing, right? So the whole publishing thing, and you know, again, from my perspective at the Academy of Management, we look at this always very carefully, but I'm looking at the whole publishing landscape, and I'm thinking, oh my God, it may be broken. And so I don't know what the alternative is. I don't know how we move forward, and I don't know how we ask questions. But I think we're not doing the jobs that we as intellectuals, as we as academics could potentially be doing. And it is a collective we, right? It's a whole system of this stuff. Which may be why we are under attack, at least in the US in many ways, right? You know, they're questioning our value. And so that might be something that I'm thinking about. But I'm also questioning the value of our politicians in many ways, right? So again, and I put that back on us, because we're getting we're getting the politicians we deserve, right? Remember that old saying. But instead of having people that really understand kind of the nature of what's going on and the nature of the inequality and the nature of these new right, they're debating things that nobody cares about, right? And that's a problem. And as long as we continue to sort of stay in this bubble, you know, our bubble is slowly eroding in some ways, but it has not burst. And when it bursts, I'm afraid it might be too late. You know, when I think about why Europe, and I agree with you, Carlos, I think, you know, I think they maybe are less about shareholder value, but it's because there's family firms, right? Family firms are what drive like most of the economy around the world, as opposed to the US, where it's all this shareholder value. So we are actually even at odds with the rest of the world. So I don't know. I don't have any answers. The only thing I do know is the responsibility does lie with us, because we're the most privileged people in the world. Why aren't we addressing these things more?
Thank you. Beth, concluding remarks.
Sorry, Beth, we had a bit of a power outage. Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating. This is not where I expected this discussion to go. I think the point about Europe is really important because the governments are much more proactive as well. You know, both individual governments and the EU, in terms of trying to keep firms in check. Now, by and large, the firms are smaller, and so they're, you know, I think there are firms that governments can no longer control, you know, particularly in the US, and Amazon does come to mind, but I think the car companies were like that in their day as well. And I think the other thing is that, as you know, sort of not hopeless, but somewhat hopeless, as this looks from US perspective, think about how it looks to smaller firms that have very little political power in the global economy, or in the global system, and to even larger firms that are less powerful. I think the U.S. I'd love to see the U.S. step up and fix some of this stuff, because there are an awful lot of, there goes the power again, there are an awful lot of other firms that are depending on how the U.S. does things, and they just don't have the power to do it themselves. So, sorry, I live and work in some of those. But
thank you. Aslı?
I think there was a question about what would the future look like. I think one of the challenges of especially flat platform businesses in trying to be in globally present and kind of cut across borders virtually is they're not doing it so well now. One of the reasons is the system works if you can get this credibly information that's instantaneous about the demand side and the supply side. But when you go abroad in a different context, the preference for the object can be detected, but you cannot detect the ranking of that person's preference against everything else that they can and would like to do in their own context. So that's where I think the culture, the history, what our nation states mean, what our nations mean, how do preferences are involved. It gets into the social psychology of things, primary socialization, secondary socialization. So firms themselves will need to be really well versed in this space as well to be able to pursue their dream of no national borders, one global market. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And this, I think, all resonates with the embedded people in their context. And I think all of us brought that up to some degree. And that context matters for the harvesting of this knowledge that also has this predictive power, instantaneously predictive power. And I see AI as kind of the biggest technological tool in the arsenal of corporations. And I see that's what it's kind of geared towards, the use of AI and its implications. So that's an interesting area to think about as well.
Thank you. I have a question for all of you, actually. And I would like to piggyback on, not really piggyback on, but build on Beth's points. She said US should take the lead. Sure. But India has a different perspective. China has a different perspective of how things should be going forward. Recently, Brazil joined them, and they also have a different perspective of how things should be being done. They have a different perspective of how companies should be run, what companies should be doing, how they should be organized. How is this going to happen when at least China, India, Brazil have a different perspective of how things should be taking place?
Okay. Go ahead, Sharon, please.
Yeah. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Chinese scholar at Steve's, actually. And he said something to me that was rather interesting. And, I think China certainly has its issues and its shortcomings, and we're all aware of that. But one of the things he said to me is that the government can go to a very large firm in China and say, listen, you have benefited from this community in X ways or whatever. The community needs whatever, a community service, fresh water, whatever, and you're going to do it. And they do it. And so, again, I'm not trying to say that there's not problems, but every different way of doing something has something that we can learn about. Now, I think the bigger issue is all this nationalism that's happening. And I'm not so sure that we are in such a global world anymore. I think nationalism is really, really, it's here. It's going to be here for a while. And so I think the problem is we're entrenching. And by entrenching, we cease to kind of learn these things. Because again, why does the opioid crisis happen in Southern Ohio, right? Why do we have this crisis? I mean, this is just shame that we have such a thing, right? Where was the government? Where were they when we needed them? And so I think in the US, we also have our shortcomings, and we could learn from some of these other systems, but because everybody's entrenching in their nationalistic tendencies, I'm not so sure how willing we're going to be to learn from each other. Just my thoughts. I know I'm more, Carlos, when you said you were being pessimistic, I'm like, oh, no. I've got you covered.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to imply that the US has to solve the world's problems. And by the way, I have a US passport, so I can say things. But I think there are things that some nation state needs to take the lead on in terms of fixing. And I think the US is the fairly obvious, in terms of power, both economic and political, that's the obvious place to start. I do not believe that the governance of firms in India is going to start looking a lot like the US. I don't think so. And partly, as Sharon said, an awful lot of the really important firms here are family firms, and some of them are actually already quite committed to giving back. India has it set up such that large firm, basically large, if you're large enough, which isn't terribly large, you are forced to give X% to corporate social responsibility. So I don't think India has any interest or desire to become like the United States, but I think in terms of some of the global mechanisms and some of the leadership, I think that's going to fall in the US.
Just a quick comment to Beth's statement. I think if we kind of build on what you're saying and combine the question and what it inspires, it might be very useful, just kind of this reverse perspective of very useful to look at flagship, very large corporations out of these competing economic powers and how they handle their operations domestically and internationally. It's almost going to give us a sense of what is the relationship between nation states that are vying for power positions and their flagship corporations. And maybe this gets back to your East India Trading Company argument that the governments have these ties with large corporations and vice versa, and then how they conduct their international expansion and operations will be a sort of a predictive insight into what the nation states are also have intentions on doing. It's the reverse perspective. It used to be whatever the nation is doing, through taxes, and Ilgaz always tells me and reminds me this, government talks to the firms through taxes. He was just saying this morning, if the tax is lowered, go for it. If the tax is higher, don't do it. So I think that communication is now really a lot more heterogeneous between governments and firms and in terms of their expansions. So it might be interesting to compare and contrast what these new power positions will look like.
Thank you. We've got a couple of minutes. I cannot see the chat or the Q&A box for some reason. Maybe it's a technical problem on my end. Anything?
I can read a question.
Yeah.
How organization, and this is from Anna Dimandi, how organization on the age labor market can challenge the knowledge of people against technology implementation. So this is kind of interacting population dynamics with how technology is being implemented and adopted.
Karen, you should answer it because you owe me 5 minutes.
That is the question, right? That is the question. That's the question we need to be looking at, because that's the question of displacement, right? That's the question of what's going on, of the winners and losers. So Anna, it's a great question. I have no answers.
I can make a pessimistic prediction, just to kind of be fashionable like you guys, is that if we assume all of the current technological trends come to fruition and we interpret them correctly, it sounds like the only viable activity in the workforce that will have economic value is being able to use and modify artificial intelligence, because presumably if it really takes hold, then it should be replacing even decision making. So then, there's really no task that I can think of that will have anything else but decision making. So then the only thing is left is to be able to use the AI and tweak it and improve it. So that's just a handful of, small percentage of the workforce. So it won't matter if we're old or young at that point.
So let me pipe up from a different perspective, and it's a rich country perspective. I would rather go to a farmer's market than a supermarket at this point. I would rather eat my own food at home, or there are things, you see the most wonderful things on Etsy, craft is still out there. I know that people are oohing and eyeing over AI, and I think it is marvelous what people can get ChatGPT to do. Well, my son said he tweaked it so that he's not a writer anymore, but he was trying to be a writer. He said it could do first drafts, and then I could I could start. Maybe you all are doing first drafts on ChatGPT. I haven't mastered that yet, but one thing I think it can't do is the unforeseen future. It can't see holes. It can't see what isn't there. Now there's some, anyway, let me say that categorically. It can't see what isn't there. Maybe humans won't be able to see very well, but can perceive in their individuality something that isn't there in the vast. My example of this is Eric von Hippel, who he saw in a world where it was all about producers and producer innovation. He saw users as innovators, and he built a field. I doubt that even and he's a big AI fan, by the way, but I don't think our AIs can do that yet. Now, maybe there isn't much of a demand for that, except I think there is at the micro level. New recipes. Now, I don't mind if I'd be happy to have ChatGPT do some interesting recombinations of food. But anyway, maybe it can be our friend.
Thank you so much for your thoughts, for your participation, for your time. You're out of time. I need to end this debate, which you want to call a conversation. Okay, thank you so much. Bye.